let's get started then. I assume you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So welcome everyone to the March OpenChain AI Working Group session. We always start the Linux Foundation meetings with the antitrust policy notice. It's given at the start of all Linux Foundation meetings. And the information on the antitrust policy can be found on the website in the second paragraph. And if you are a member of your company is a member of the Linux Foundation, then you can contact Andy Updegrove for more information on the antitrust policy. So moving on, we were working last time on the Bill of Materials Management Guide, and last time I think we'd got all the way through most of the sections, but we kind of got into a deeper dive into the transparency area. And I know Kieran and Karen last time were sort of discussing things around transparency. Let me just get down to the right section. And with the transparency, we kind of put a pause on this when we originally started this document. The transparency can be a whole host of different things, and I think at the time we thought, let's try and solve some of the other areas. But that was 12 months ago, and clearly over the last few months in this working group, transparency keeps on coming up. So I wanted to kind of open this section for discussion. It should be noted, though, that the board hasn't, or isn't, I guess, unaware of the idea of us putting transparency obligations into this document. So I think as part of the working group, we kind of propose things, and then at some point we will go back to the board for their thoughts and their guidance. Certainly for the transparency, and then we had a couple of other points towards the bottom. So I did want to spend a bit of time today on these transparency obligations where we felt we could add value to build trust into the supply chain, and where we think a red line is that we don't want to cross. And as you can see from the right hand side, lots of people had lots of good discussion points, and we kind of thought, let's pause and have further discussion on transparency at the next meeting, which is today. And I asked Kieran and Karen beforehand if they kind of wanted to share some of their own points on transparency. And I see Kieran is here today, so it's more for discussion rather than presenting anything. But Kieran, I don't know what your thoughts are on transparency, and we can have back and forth with people as we've done in the previous sessions.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of what's been removed from the document, and so I might be repeating things that have already been discussed. And so just, if you'll bear with me, maybe
Sure.
Maybe some of this is relevant and some isn't. So I want to give briefly an overview of the moving parts, what's currently happening in the EU at least. I'll be very brief. It's just to be aware that there's more than just the AI Act. There is the AI office itself, which has a large number of new staff members, and so many of them are still understanding the various subtopics of the AI regulation topic. In the European Parliament, we have the internal market, the IMCO committee, and that is reviewing the implementation of the AI Act. And so they had a meeting in February, on February 17th. There is the European Data Protection Board, which is reviewing many of the privacy and GDPR aspects. And so they gave an important opinion on this on 17th of December. And they also announced that they will be repurposing their ChatGPT task force to be an AI task force, which suggests they'll be getting more into this topic as time goes by. Then we also have the national authorities, and so this is the requirement in the AI Act to have a national competent authority, and so this will monitor some of the regulatory obligations that people have in the member states. And so most member states have not yet designated or created the national competent authority. And one of the debates in many of the member states is whether an existing entity such as the Data Protection Commission, which a lot of member states set up to work on GDPR compliance. So sorry, do I have to click OK on something there? Speaking language? No. I've got a dialog box asking me to transcribe into Chinese. If I need to click anything, just tell me. So the national authorities, so there are already national authorities for GDPR enforcement, as these are usually called Data Protection Commission or something similar. And many of these are candidates to become also the national competent authority for the AI Act. And this brings certain advantages in terms of these entities are already expertise with digital topics and with privacy. However, on the other side, some people think that they might be overly active on enforcement of privacy regulation, and so this might lead to a lot of very strict application of the privacy regulations. So that's the national authorities, which we'll have to deal with and check the opinions of. And then there is this general purpose AI working group, and they have the four sub working groups, and one of those is split into copyright and transparency. So the working group on transparency for general purpose AI has published the first draft and then the second draft in December. The third draft was expected to come out in February, but has been delayed, and we don't have a date for the expected date at this stage for the third draft, but it was expected already maybe at the end of last week. Presumably, hopefully it'll arrive maybe sometime this week. The delay can't go on forever because the AI Act has a date in it which says that the code of practice should be completed by the 2nd of May. And so it's definitely not going to just continue sliding indefinitely. But also the longer it does slide, the more difficult it's going to be for the AI office to react to whatever feedback they get, because they will have less time between the deadline for receiving input and then actually having to publish the final version. So that's it, the 5 entities that we have to keep an eye on: the AI Office, the European Parliament's IMCO Committee, the European Data Protection Board, the national authorities, and the General Purpose AI Working Group. So these are the various sources of information. The current status of the code of practice from the General Purpose AI Working Group, if we just look at the second draft, which was published in December, is that there are complaints in both directions. There are people saying that the obligations to give information to downstream providers are not high enough, or they're not demanded, not required to provide enough information, and this may prevent downstream providers from being able to comply with the European Data Protection Board's opinion. And then at the same time, there are concerns that too much is being asked and that it might not be possible to publish all the data that would be required by the General Purpose AI Code of Practice, since some of this would contain GDPR infringing information. So it's still quite uncertain how both of these criticisms can be addressed, and the people drafting the code of practice have a difficult task of trying to work on compliance with the AI Act when also having to be compliant with the European Data Protection Board's opinion and possibly decisions from the other bodies that I mentioned earlier. So that's the European context. Then regarding the document that's being worked on for this group, I looked at the previous discussions about section titles, and I think, I'm not sure if this is maybe arbitrary and maybe everyone just has a different opinion, but there seemed to be transparency information being proposed for the license obligations section, and so it's possible that maybe a logical way to organize this would be to have a copyright obligations section, and within that, license obligations would be a subsection, because the first thing to check is whether copyright is even required, copyright permission is even required, because if it's not required, then we could simply ignore the licenses of the training data itself, and that would simplify many things. But of course, copyright's scope will be different in almost every country, because the laws are different and because the case law is different. So this would suggest that the broader we can be in publishing data and compliance information, the more useful that would be for people in various different countries where the copyright law may require things that are not required in your country. So this is just so that's I think the transparency might not fit into the license obligations section. However, maybe the terminology suggested this because there would be license information would be sometimes required under the title of transparency. So it's possible that license information should be documented within transparency rather than transparency being documented within license obligations. This then when I was looking at this, it also made me think that the code of practice is only for general purpose AI, and so I wasn't sure if there's the suggestion in the document that general purpose AI be flagged as such, or if there is a suggestion to document the risk level according to the AI Act in this document. But then again, you probably don't want to make it too specific to the European Union's regulation at the same time. I saw there were multiple comments about different types of obligation to include or not include, and this made me think of Mandelbrot fractals. You can keep zooming in infinitely, and so the level of detail to include is mostly arbitrary. But this also made me think that sometimes it's easiest to simply say, provide this information if the legislation requires, or please keep abreast of the applicable regulation. But then again, if people are actually looking for something that would help them to apply the legislation, then that it wouldn't be very helpful simply to remind them that they have to comply with the local regulations. So I wonder if there could be details added, possibly in an annex or possibly in a separate document, where there would be some guidance as to at least listing maybe the regulations that may be relevant, and listing information sources, official sources such as the Code of Practice or the opinion of the European Data Protection Board or other authorities in different parts of the world. So maybe by documenting that in a separate section or a separate document, it would solve the question of how much information needs to go into this particular document. So that would answer the question of what information to include. And then the last thing that I thought might be useful would be, rather than talking about legal obligations, but think in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of publishing information which may or may not be required by the local regulations. So the advantages could be things such as by making data available, even when it's not an obligation, it shows good faith. It enables people in different regulatory situations to work on compliance that you might not have foreseen. It makes it more certain that people downstream will have the information that they need in order for them to comply. It makes it easier for people in other regions also to comply with regulations that you might not have been aware of, and that might be written after you publish your AI model. And so this is not even a case of knowing all the regulations that exist right now. It's also being future-proofing the compliance. So by publishing that information, it can address that issue. In terms of more practical advantages, by making the compliance data public, there is an increase of a better certainty in terms of what is being shared will not become problematic at a later point, and so this may increase people's willingness to invest in a certain technology if they have more certainty and future proofing in that sense. The documenting things publicly may also help us to discuss with policymakers how complex compliance can be, and even if we are able to gather the information that is not an obligation in one region, then lawmakers in another region may be able to see what can be asked for and what doesn't exist or what is very complex to ask for. And the last positive I could think of is that by being more enthusiastically transparent, it simply makes our work more visible. And so this is another way to ensure that when policymakers are writing regulations, they have a better idea of who to talk to. So those would be the reasons in favor of an enthusiastic compliance approach, where we would maximize the publication of compliance data. Disadvantages, of course, are one would be that there is the risk of attracting increased scrutiny. By increasing transparency, you also make your system easier to audit, and well, that shouldn't be a disadvantage, but in reality, sometimes that may be something you have to consider depending on the authorities in the region in which you're operating. And the second disadvantage would be regarding the possibility of leaking personal data. And so this could happen if you have an AI model in which the data is anonymized. The data itself, the training data, would still contain the non-anonymized information, and so that could take extra care, and if mistakes were made, then there could be a leaking of personal data. So these advantages and disadvantages, this could be presented, and of course any of these can be removed or changed, but this could be presented as a way or like a checklist for people to evaluate whether they think it would be beneficial to willingly disclose information that may not be a regulatory obligation, at least in their region. And with that, I think maybe I would stop there.
Thanks, Kieran. I really appreciate that.
Okay, I'm not sure if that format is useful, but it's just arriving late to a document is sometimes a challenge. But if people have comments or questions on this, I'm happy to adapt.
Should we open it up to questions?
Yeah, so I think those are really great points, and something that I think we should focus on is the notion of it being voluntary. Like you said, I can't remember the actually used excited transparency or robust, or you use a nice adjective there. But I think to the extent someone wants to behave that way, we should definitely have a framework in place. But I would caution against creating obligations that go beyond the bare minimum, depending on the activity and the geography of the activity. I know for the code of practice, that's one concern that's been raised over and over, which is making sure that the code of practice isn't expanding the pool of obligations beyond what the actual act says. And I know there's ongoing discussions there, and I would just caution that we don't create additional burdens and obligations through the OpenChain compliance that might sour someone's ability or desire to become compliant.
Yeah, if I can add some a small bit of information to that. So yeah, enthusiastic compliance. This is the idea that we thought about during the discussions of the Cyber Resilience Act. And so the idea is that the EU was the first mover in certain senses. And then for compliance to be kept reasonable, it would be very advantageous if the rest of the world would have something that was compatible or similar or a subset. And that's not because everyone should copy what the EU does, but it's just to avoid having different sets of obligations in each region and different pieces of software having the compliance data for different subsets, and this could get very, very inefficient. And so if we would like other parts of the world to adopt something similar, then maybe something, if we can show that this is working quite well, and if we can try and maximize how smooth it all looks, then that could increase our chances of having something that's similar in the rest of the world. So that's one of the, hopefully, the advantages of this enthusiastic compliance approach.
Any further comments here?
Yeah, hey, this is Dave Marr from Qualcomm. Karen, that was great. That was a great list of issues. I didn't catch all of them. Do you have like a list of like an outline of those that maybe you can circulate for us to sort of think about further? In particular, one of the ones that I'm still like sort of like trying to work through is the idea that you had of, instead of transparency as a subset of license compliance, for transparency to be sort of a header point. What else would be under transparency besides license compliance? Are you thinking about like data set disclosure? Because I think there was some pushback on that on the OSI definitional discussion.
Yeah, for the notes that I've made, maybe Matthew, if I send them to you later, maybe you could forward them to the list. I don't know if that's the best way. And so for the topic titles, I think maybe a transparency section could include subsections then on access, disclosure, and license information. And so then license obligations would be separate, and that would be linked to questions of copyright. And transparency would be more questions of market regulation and market access. And so within transparency, you would talk about access and disclosure and license information. This seemed to me to be a possible structure. It might be useful, but I'll put it in the email and it can be considered.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Again, your talk was very substantive. They've got a lot of really interesting, I think, very helpful concepts. One thing that I would sort of frame though as a sort of a macro question, and this kind of goes to the way that OpenChain itself for open source was formulated. OpenChain, had the luxury of actually getting discussed in the context of almost 20 years of actual practice, at least 15, depending on when you say that, open source as a substantive movement started to get traction. So we had a lot of industry practice that we ended up normalizing in the concepts that we put into OpenChain for 5230. And that's the ISO IEC specification. And I think in the context of AI, we don't have that luxury. To your point, there's so many areas where the practice is still evolving, both by industry as well as by government. There's going to be, of course, some risk, and that's you outlined the framework in Europe, but of course there's other frameworks as well. And so what I'm trying to get to is, a multinational company is going to essentially try to create one process, and that one process is ideally going to be form fit for multiple jurisdictions, at least the jurisdictions where that multinational is going to be delivering its products or services. And in practice, I think what happens is such large companies end up delivering to the most common requirements. And if there's a region that has stricter requirements, essentially, they are tempted, the company is tempted to create a practice that normalizes that more strict requirement across all of its processes, because it wants to, again, have one singular process, because usually it's going to have a canonical product line, a canonical service line. So it's going to be difficult for it to sort of like tweak, every aspect of that particular delivery mechanism, to conform. So it's going to try to have one, and it's going to be, I think, hard for us to, in a copyright context, when you describe copyright as a filter, essentially, or a question to be considered before the license analysis. I think that's an important observation. I just don't quite, I can't quite figure out how to put that into place. If for example, there's a dozen copyright regimes around data sets, because there's some subjectivity to the expressive components of those collections sometimes. Yeah, I think you get to a place where you add a layer of complexity ahead of the licensing, and I'm wondering if we're oversimplifying by doing it this way, or whether or not we really do need to embrace, that copyright layer first. That's a long-winded comment or question, but I'm just kind of I'm trying to just respond to, I think, your good observation that copyright is a layer that needs to be considered at some point.
No, you're completely right. The layers should never be added if they're just going to be adding complexity. So yeah, you have to indeed avoid academically analyzing this and adding things simply because they're logical on paper. But I was thinking that the copyright filter might be useful, because if you're making an AI model and it is using either data that is fallen into the public domain, and I'll add a comment on that, data that's fallen into the public domain, or data which is never copyrightable, then it might be the case that you're doing all the training and distribution under the assumption that you don't need copyright permission in the first place. And so this would simplify if you were able to make that assertion. So, but I'm not sure if that's if that's a very small corner case, then there's no point in having that filter for everything. But it might turn out to be useful, or it might not. So it's something to consider. But you could be right. It could be simply one of those things that you can't rely on in every jurisdiction, and therefore you can't rely on it in any jurisdiction. And so even at the start of this comment, I mentioned things that had fallen into the public domain, but I believe there are a few countries in the world where the public domain does not exist the way we understand it, and so it might not be a universal idea that there are some things which can be distributed without needing copyright permission. So it's that is something that might not be useful, but it's just possibly worth considering.
Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, it might be, I haven't arrived at any particular point of view. I'm just trying to mull through the issues, but I take your good point that if public domain becomes more broadly accepted, or in the US, the debate around fair use, if fair use becomes a much broader understood exception to copyright infringement, then that aspect of a copyright filter does become more valuable. And on the other hand, if my example, that was probably a limit stretching example of a dozen copyright regimes, if it actually simplifies to essentially 2 to 3, then that's also much more doable. It's a good concept. I think it's worth considering. I don't know that I can land that question myself.
I suppose it could also be used in parallel rather than as a filter. There could be a project or a company that is distributing an AI model on the assumption that they don't need copyright permission at all, and they could at least document that we are distributing this and we have not consulted the licenses because we don't consider them applicable, but they could still list the licenses and provide that information so that if somebody else in a different part of the world does think that copyright would apply, then those people could consult the licenses if necessary. And so it could also exist in parallel. But I think that's maybe all I can say on that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Karen.
Any other comments from anyone? Hearing none. Dave, how best do you think we should proceed here? Should we get the notes from Kieran and review what we want, and then, because there's kind of been a number of opinions here, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how best to proceed. If you're talking, Dave, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, I think those are all good points for us to sort of consider additionally, like offline. If anybody else has additional thoughts, I think that we would welcome them jumping in. I really like the points that might suggest that a refactoring discussion might be helpful. Not that I think that we should refactor at this point, but maybe we should. In other words, Kieran introduced some concepts that I don't know that I fully thought through, and it probably for me, I would appreciate some time to think about that and maybe come back with additional thoughts.
Okay, I think yeah, probably lots of people are in the same boat there. So why don't we take the summary? If Kieran can send those to me, I can send them to the mailing list, and they can be for discussion for our next meeting.
Can I ask for feedback on one item? If there's time, I don't want to eat up too much of the discussion.
Go for it.
So on the idea of putting information into an annex or a separate document, or maybe this group already knows of a repository or somewhere that is doing this, and maybe it's not necessary, but sometimes there seems to be discussion about aspects that are specific to the EU AI Act or to other laws. And I'm wondering, is this document the place for those discussions or for those details? And if not, then they should be somewhere. And so is there any work being done, or would there be any way to document the relevant laws, opinions, and official documents of the different regions that people may want to comply with?
I'm not aware of any. What are your thoughts, though, given your knowledge of things like the EU AI Act, of that changing over time? Because I guess the 5230 standard that has kind of lasted 5 years, it was probably still appropriate beforehand, because things haven't really evolved in that area.
Well, it's that when I talk to people from outside the EU, they're aware of the AI Act, but they wouldn't be aware of decisions from national authorities or the meeting of the European Parliament on the 25th of February or 17th of February. And so I wonder, there must be decisions that I am not aware of in other parts of the world. And so it seems that it would be interesting to gather that information, but at the same time, it wouldn't, maybe not the place to put it directly into the text of this document, unless it was in an annex. But I'm not sure if that's something you do, or if you have a policy for avoiding links to decisions which may be superseded or be out of date in a few years' time.
Dave, how did we handle this with 5230 when that was created? You were involved a bit more than I was on that.
Yeah, we had the luxury of not having to deal with, you know, the copyrightability question, and so that was maybe one differentiator. It's a real question. You know, if people wanted to sort of press the issue, they could probably formulate some good arguments around, you know, how much of software itself is functional and how much is expressive. Unlike literature, there's, you know, you're typically writing code, you know, for some functional outcome. You know, and that's maybe differentiable from, let's say, you know, a story arc in a video game. That's of course also software, but you know, there's you know, in the context of open source, people are generally writing things that are that where the value is the function itself. But nevertheless, we were able to kind of like, you know, stand on pretty firm footing in terms of how it was pragmatically being dealt with in industry. And for us, it was just a matter of normalizing the approaches so that within a supply chain, people were basically eliminating repeat work. And having just come off a multi-tiered supply chain discussion on the open source side very recently, you know, it's, you know, I do appreciate how much friction gets removed from the system simply by providing everything in a consistent format under a compatible philosophy around compliance. In the context of the AI field as it sits today, it does seem like there's so many moving parts that I think that you know, the practice itself isn't quite distilled firmly, and yet you know, the reason why is because the law is changing, right? The law is changing very quickly because it's trying to catch up to the technology itself, and that's probably going to be the case for some time, right? You know, recently we've been hearing that Brazil is interested in pushing out some regulations, and that wasn't really sort of on our roadmap, you know. And so, but you would naturally expect that, you know, all major countries will be pursuing this. So it's going to be a mess, and I think that, you know, notwithstanding the desire for, you know, our work product to be very useful to people, I don't know that we can replace the legal function around interpreting, you know, what needs to be adhered to. I've been asking for a tracker just in the U.S. of all the different state regulations that are kind of like pending, and it's over 200 right now, and you know, it's really too much for anyone to, you know, sort of like become competent at knowing about and getting a given moment. And that's just one country. So I think it's probably a little bit too ambitious to be able to have that. I think it would be maybe easier for us to come up with broad-based practice pointers that don't necessarily align perfectly with every framework, legal framework, but become, call it the common denominator approach that allows industry to adhere to some, you know, some basic practices that are common practices that does eliminate friction within the AI supply chain. But and it can that can adjust, of course, based on sort of like any corner cases that and new laws that come out. But if we can get the basics right and get consensus on those points, then maybe we come up with a version almost like a 0.1 and maybe evolve that into something that's maybe a little bit more stable over time. But I think having a rough draft now is probably useful immediately to the industry. You know, if only to say this is if we're drawing a large Venn diagram, this is where 7, 8, 9, 10 different concentric circles end up converging, and maybe that's the sweet spot, and we can evolve from there. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and I think elsewhere in the documentation, and don't quote me on this, but it's words to the effect of, applicable laws in the jurisdiction that you are doing business in, or something along those lines.
Mhm.
But and I do like the idea of that. To my earlier point, that laws can change, and we know in this area it's evolving much quicker than license obligations. So keeping the guidelines very broad, I think personally is what we should aim for. But then having supporting documentation, to Kieran's point, could be helpful, that we could edit, and I use the sort of global we could edit, that the standard could direct people to as kind of supplementary supporting information. And I know I draw reference to the sort of education side of 5230 that is part of that work, but it's not part of the ISO standards. It's kind of supplementary parts there. But we want to be clear that we're not providing legal guidance. It's more maybe links to papers and other things that may be relevant.
Mm.
These are my opinions. I sense Dave and I are probably on similar wavelengths. I'd like to hear what other
Mhm.
people agree. Do we like that idea of keeping this guidance at a high level, but then to Kieran's point of adding additional supplementary information that is separate to this document and maintained separately? I should have turned that on its head. Does anyone have any objections for that? And hearing none, that we consider proceeding in that sense. Okay, so if Kieran, you can share the summary of what you said there, because I think there's lots of good points that I think a lot of people here probably need to mull over. And then we can maybe draw some wording in the document as relevant, and then direct people to more detailed documentation.
Okay, I'll send that this evening.
Thank you, Kieran. I appreciate that. Great. Does anyone else have any points on transparency that they'd like to raise? Again, hearing none. The only other area, and I'll share my screen again, that we had in the document for further discussion was around governance and human oversight. And this was something that Prasad, and it looks like Yuri has created a comment as well, said that we would review and discuss in further details. Prasad, I think you're on the line here. For those people who weren't here last time, can you maybe just explain your thoughts around the life cycle of models, and in terms of how we could provide guidance to build trust for different stages of models? I think this was the point you were trying to pick up last time.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you, Matthew. So, what I was trying to state was, as the model usage proliferates, right? So, you obviously have various models, both open source and closed models. And as time progresses, you're going to have increased usage or distributed usage of these various models across multiple offerings that particular organization supports. So what we are trying to get at is, at the organizational level, you are now, even though you may have like a responsible AI framework that will have to make sure not just the simple impact analysis, like one-time impact analysis of these models at the time when they are being considered, but also some sort of an ongoing process that will essentially drive the entire life cycle of a given model's usage across one or more offerings that organization is shipping, right? So this is something that I was kind of taking a step back and trying to understand that can we have provide some level of, at least, like again, it's up to the individual organizations to how they want to implement this life cycle management of these various models. It's totally up to them, up to the individual organizations, and that may vary, right, depending on the type of models used and the usage of these models, how they are distributed across multiple offerings, multiple product offerings. It really varies, but just trying to have, like, at a higher level, some level of a responsible AI framework team, or some um, regulation around, like, a process around how these models span of usage is um, you know audit trailed for the entirety of that particular model. So I would envision that this model, let's say that it gets picked up at certain point in time, it gets used across one or more offerings as part of the actual development process, or for whatever the reasons, and then at some point that model is going to get either upgraded to some other version, and then eventually at some point either it's going to get replaced or upgraded. So that is something that we need to have some level of uh, record keeping and ensure that the transparency exists. That way, if someone wants to go back in time for a given product offering, say 2 years ago or a year ago, because some of these product offerings can last that long, you may be able to, or the organization may be able to provide a series of audit trails of the life cycle of the models, the AI models being used in their respective organization. So I'll stop right there, and that's kind of what we were trying to allude to in this section.
Comments from people? Do we want to capture this sort of information in the document? Are we in agreement that this is going to be helpful and beneficial? The fact that we review the previous 9 clauses each time things progress in the model to different stages?
Yeah, I think one, I would say, even practical purpose could be that by having this process in place, you can always, like, each organization have their own policy that they can adapt, internal policy on how depends on the relevancy of these models, depends on other factors, like let's say that this model has a very active adoption, it probably has a very good community support. In some cases where, let's say that the models have much more newer versions that came out, so they can look at these various factors and they can consider their own policies. Like, they can say, hey, probably we should make a policy where maybe this particular product offering, or a set of product offerings, cannot be using any AI models that is over a year old or over 2 years old, or something like that, right? So it's up to the individual organizations to have the specific process implementation, but all we are trying to say is, at a higher level, to have that level of visibility for a large organization that might be leveraging one or more open or closed models across multiple product offering could be really worthwhile.
Anyone got comments on this? Well, not hearing any major comments or concerns here. I do think there's some value in reviewing different stages of the model for points that we've raised at different times. I think, Prasad, maybe I can ask you to sort of draft this clause or this section of the document. Would you be willing to do that?
Sure. Is this the 10, right? Section 10?
Section 10, indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take care of it. If you can just shoot me that link via email, that'd be great. I'll take a look. I'll get it done. All right.
For everyone
Thank you.
else, it's in the chat, but I can send it round afterwards as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I can email it, Prasad. No worries. So the only other area was around human oversight. Again, a topic that we paused last year, but decided to discuss further in previous months. Yari was, I don't think Yari is on the call today. He joins the other call usually. Thinking about autonomous car use when there's likely not to be a human overseer, because I think we'd had previous discussions around when a model is being used, the output of the model should be reviewed by a human, or there should be some oversight process to monitor, evaluate, and correct AI outputs. But this caused problems with that use case of autonomous vehicles, where it's unlikely that there'll be human oversight before the car makes its decision. It's come up back and forth a few times. Yes, we should have something like this in. It's probably more complex. We are getting towards the end of finalizing this document, so would appreciate people's thoughts on human oversights for the outputs of models, if we think we should or shouldn't have it in. Yari clearly, I think, is in the camp of it's relevant, but in some cases it may not be. So we should probably put an if necessary in there if need be.
Hey, I'm just thinking about, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for the conversation when Yari was. I think I'm more attracted to, the broader statement that we have on governance than, delineating individual requirements that are certainly good ideas in the context of AI, but these are things that I think should be deferred to, the regulatory framework. And so, yeah, I agree with Nick. This is a heavy, it's a heavy field that has a lot of nuance to it. And I think for future proofing this, I think that it's better for us to be lightweight on trying to re-articulate things that really should be well articulated in the overarching legal framework already. And because that might change from region to region, the risk of overfitting or even underfitting might be a pretty significant one.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Victor, you've got your hand up and you're supposed to put something in the chat.
I participate in the SPDX community. Have a question. I mean, to get your opinion. If you see, I posted the relevant metadata for SPDX licensing profile you can see that there's not much field actually in the licensing profile itself. So all the legal content in the individual SPDX license on the actual source code website itself, GitHub mostly. So a description of the license. So my question is, there are some tendency to add the legal, especially for data sets, adding the whether it's shareable, those licensing related terms on the data set metadata itself. Do you think doing that is an effective way of from a legal perspective, or should be still kind of a self-contained licensing contract as has been done before? I don't know. Did I explain this?
I think I missed your last point. Just explain that one again.
Yeah.
Question.
So compare with the traditional way of if you say I want to both a software model and data to follow a particular license, you need to draft the license terms and add the information to the SPDX license list, which is what I posted there. So SPDX basically is a pointer to the license terms. So now there are tendency nowadays to when you create a data set, in the metadata itself, create a list of matrices to say, this is can be shared, is open, is free, what kind of liability. Those matrices added directly to the metadata of data set itself. Do you think, first of all, did I explain the differences between the two approach clearly? Oh, I'm still confusing you with the situation there.
No, I'm understanding that part.
Okay. So if you understand that part, if I were to explain that part, do you think that's an effective way to adding the legal licensing data to the data set description itself? Is that a good practice, or should still stick to the just drafting a complete license and add it to the SPDX license list way?
That I don't know the answer to. What do others think here?
I have an opinion about that. I don't know if it's going to be, universally well accepted, though. I'll offer it just so we can have this conversation. Thanks, Kieran. When you have a license text, there's of course going to be questions around what it means, and there could be inherent ambiguity. Some licenses, are even this day sort of debated as to what some nuanced requirements might be. If you try to distill that into metadata, into essentially some characteristics that one believes that this license might have, and I think you'll be right like 99% of the time. I think the common licenses like the BSD, for example, for the most part, these are licenses that have been heavily discussed and debated, and on the other hand, there's like the GPL v2. Even to this day, there's still a couple nuances that are still actively kind of like disagreed upon. But I don't think you're proposing to capture all those details. You're just capturing sort of like some big macro level questions. And I think the purpose of putting things into metadata is so that you have things that are machine processable, so that you can run instant checks to know whether or not, let's say, an overnight build has pulled in code that is maybe incompatible with the rules of that repo. I think that automation is a very useful thing. But it's going to be, of course, always a risk, because then you have an engineer drawing what usually is going to be a legal conclusion. But even though they're right, as I mentioned, like 99% of the time, there is some risk that you're taking. So because you're kind of representing to everybody downstream, this is how one should interpret that license. I'm hard coding it into metadata. So even with that, just opposed to take off my legal hat, I think there's a lot of benefit to that in terms of us sort of like, being forced to take those positions. and doing that and committing to that practice, at least for efficiency purposes. That said, I do think that in the next couple of years, the tooling for open source itself is going to change significantly. I think I think LLMs will become deployed more widely in terms of the tooling itself, and I think that the ability to parse the information contained in these licenses becomes more automatable, at least controllable through subjective human interpretation as to how they might want to sort of like create some macro rules for a given repo. And so I wonder if sort of like XML tagging things right now might be more of a short-term thing, even though I appreciate that overarching idea that it's an efficiency gain for automation.
Yeah, exactly. You said it's kind of dilemma having that in the mostly JSON LD format, make it a lot easier for discovery, processing the metadata. Yeah. So, but it's kind of a different from what a contract, like I said, engineer deciding what metadata should be in it. It's a little different from a lawyer drafting what should be in that contract. Is that way? So, okay, cool. So I guess there's no right or wrong answer at this point. Any other thoughts?
So one aspect that I just wanted to bring up is, with regards to SPDX, especially on the software licensing profile. Per my understanding, I think the focus for that profile is primarily the underlying open source components, or for that matter, any third-party software components that are part of that given software product or service. However, if you want to capture some of these metadata, like the model metadata, I'm kind of curious, like, is there like a specific reason why you're trying to leverage the same licensing profile, as opposed to maybe we can think about using the AI and data profile that is also supported in SPDX, like starting in the 3.0 spec. So I'm just kind of curious, like, can we not leverage those profiles, because the AI and data profile has much more explicit additional attributes that we can leverage for recording some of these AI model specific and as well as training data specific provenance information. So I'm kind of curious to hear, will that be an option, like having to consider AI and data profile?
Yes, you're right. So traditionally, the licensing list is just for software license. But if you look at just a few of the licensing that's been created, I know one in particular was from forgot from UK, who is also in OpenChain. Their license is created to include not only software but a related, the model, the data. But there's not a long list of them. There's just a few license models regarding model and data. The problem for model is it doesn't have at this point like GitHub, right? GitHub is where most of the documented licensing are for the. So if you look at an SP license, it will refer to this name, which could have a corresponding kind of handle to the GitHub software repo, right? For model is not on GitHub, so that's so in order to do the same, it's necessary to have a handle to the data set, whether it's on Hugging Face or somewhere else. So it's no longer it's one place. It could be multiple different not only on Hugging Face. But the thing is, it's still possible. I think for model, it's still possible because OpenSSF is right now building a way to allow you to assign a model This way, just like you signed a software during the build process called provenance to allow you to say, this is the person who are involved in the building of the software, and same thing you can sign the model to say these are the people who are involved in building the model, both for credit as well as I guess accountability. The problem with data is you cannot do the same thing, and data is so huge. There's no way to create a hash value from a data sets. And also, data set is widely distributed. Is no, I mean, GitHub is you can say that's where most softwares are, right? And Hugging Face is where most models are. But data is just everywhere. There's no single place. That's why data is a much bigger problem. So when you're talking about licensing, yeah, so it's kind of not the same topic, but yeah, that's why I don't think it's a solved problem at this point. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. It does. I think definitely there are challenges with training data. I mean, I totally agree. And I was just trying to allude to the fact that, yeah, I mean, if there is, you know, like the AI models and, considering what earlier Dave mentioned, obviously the pace and the manner in which the distribution or even evolution of these AI models are happening, both open and closed, it's at a very, very different pace and how it is happening compared to the corresponding, like how the third party open source evolved, right? How the fast software evolved. So definitely learning, from that experience, the idea is to try to see if we can leverage some of these newer profiles that has come in. But if there is a potential for signing these models in the future, I think definitely it helps to kind of consider them, or at least try to put them on par with other software packages. That way, you kind of try to get that uniqueness problem out of the way, but you still have definitely an open issue with the training data set. And um, how do you solve that? I think that's still to be worked with. But I was just trying to allude to, trying to leverage or potentially, using these additional attributes provided in the AI and data profile for uh, recording and tracking model provenance, which could be one potential way.
Yeah, you're right. So exactly. So that's what the AI profile is built for. But if you look at the current matrix in the AI profile and the dataset profile, there's no legal terms at this point, at least. And
Right,
then
right. Agree.
so now the question is, if other standard is trying to add legal term in their corresponding, especially dataset profile, for legal purposes, should what's the best way if we work with those ecosystems to say, okay, you should. There's two ways to do it, right? One is to do the same thing as the current way, which is adding, if you want a license for dataset, do the same thing, add a license to the SPX license list, and just refer to that list. And you can probably put it in the metadata, but still, the main reference should be that SPX license list, or it can be for datasets especially, maybe in the same, because SPX also have a dataset profile. In that dataset profile, add corresponding columns matrix to track those legal terms, just for the efficiency from the engineering perspective. But yeah, that's the trade-off there, and that has not been decided yet.
Right, right. Okay, makes sense.
That's why the question is, I know there's a lot of really expertise in this group on legal, especially in this case. Yeah, what's your opinion? I think so far it looks like it is a trade-off. There's no right and wrong at this point. Am I right?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. We definitely
Prasad, we're
have
struggling to
some
hear you.
challenges.
Prasad, can you just repeat that? You broke up.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that, yeah, that sounds about right to me. I agree. I think, because even in our organization where it is easier to model the AI, essentially like, have a data model to track AI models, but as far as the licenses go, um, definitely the AI and data profile is not evolved much. We probably that's a good feedback, and certainly I wanted to perhaps pass on that feedback even to our SPDX partners, because I know that they're still in the process of evolving those profiles in the upcoming spec. So, but it's a good point that we need to consider, or we probably need to see how best we can accommodate these models, not just the models, but also the licenses pertaining to those models and the data sets. Yeah, for the time being, I think probably the option that was suggested, I think using the software profile licensing seems to be the best bet. Um, Although this could potentially be enhanced further in the future.
Oh, cool. Thanks for the feedback. Any other thoughts? Thank you. That's my question.
Thanks, Victor. Really appreciate your time there. Okay, I think we've got to the end of the agenda. Does anyone have any other things they want to raise? Hearing none, we are getting very close for this AI Bill of Materials Management Guide to be finished. There is a board meeting, I think, in June that I'd like to go back to the board and say we've done some reviews of this and ready for the board to review. I hope this is a reasonable time frame that we can all work towards. It looks like we've got a few outstanding things on transparency that Kieran and others discussed earlier, and Prasad's got the action to update that last clause. Does that seem reasonable to everyone? Hearing no comments, I'm happy to hope that everyone is okay with that. If there's nothing else, then happy to propose that we close the meeting, and this session will be repeated on Thursday in Europe Asia time zone, and then we meet again this time zone on the 1st of April, 3 till 5 UK time. Thanks everyone, appreciate their time today. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew.